No thinker before Parmenides had placed such uncompromising demands on rational discourse. Where his predecessors sought to identify the fundamental stuff of the cosmos, the Eleatic philosopher shifts the inquiry toward a more unsettling question. What must reality be like if thought is to grasp it without contradiction? The fragments of his hexameter poem, composed in the early 5th century BCE, contain the first sustained argument in Western philosophy for the strict identity of thinking and being. This lesson examines the way of truth, the rigorously argued path that denies the reality of change, plurality, and becoming, and in doing so inaugurates metaphysics as a discipline concerned with being qua being. Parmenides does not ask what the world is made of. That question, pursued by Thales, Anaximenes, and Heraclitus, presupposes something he is unwilling to grant: that the world of change and plurality is the proper object of rational inquiry. Instead, he poses a more fundamental challenge. Before investigating what exists, we must determine what can exist without contradiction. The problem has two dimensions. The ontological dimension asks what properties reality must possess. Can it have a beginning? Can it be divided? Can it move? Parmenides argues that every one of these familiar features fails the test of logical consistency. What is must be ungenerated, imperishable, indivisible, motionless, and one. Any deviation smuggles non-being into the argument, and non-being is the one thing thought cannot entertain. To think nothing is not to think at all. The epistemological dimension follows directly. If reason proves that the world reported by the senses is logically impossible, then the senses are not merely imperfect, they are systematically deceptive. We are born into a fog of appearances, trusting eyes and ears that deliver constant flux. Truth is not seen, it is deduced. The goddess in the poem does not show Parmenides anything, she argues, and he must follow the argument wherever it leads. This marks an unprecedented rupture. Earlier thinkers had disagreed about which material principle best explained the cosmos. Parmenides disagrees about what a legitimate explanation even looks like. He replaces the search for an arche with an inquiry into the logical structure of being as such. He invents ontology, and no subsequent thinker, from Plato onward, has been able to ignore him. Everything we know about Parmenides comes from a single poem, On Nature, composed in Homeric hexameters around 475 BCE. Of its original length, roughly 160 lines survive, distributed across 19 fragments. The language is deliberately archaic, rich in epic imagery and oracular pronouncement, a choice that has complicated interpretation ever since. Our access to the text depends entirely on later authors who quoted it for their own purposes. The most significant is Simplicius, a 6th century Neoplatonist who transcribed Fragment 8, the philosophical core of the Way of Truth, into his commentary on Aristotle's Physics. Without Simplicius, the central argument would be lost. The proem, describing Parmenides' chariot journey to the goddess, survives through Sextus Empiricus. Proclus, Clement of Alexandria, Plutarch, and Diogenes Laertius contribute additional brief quotations and testimonies. The hermeneutical challenge is formidable. All our evidence is fragmentary, indirect, and mediated by authors who were anything but neutral. Some sought to refute Parmenides, others to absorb him into their own systems. The poetic medium compounds the difficulty, since images borrowed from epic and religious discourse coexist with the strictest deductive reasoning in Greek antiquity. Scholars continue to disagree about the poem's original scope and the correct sequence of its surviving parts. Parmenides lived in Elea, a Greek colony on the Tyrrhenian coast of southern Italy, founded around 540 BCE by Phocian refugees fleeing Persian expansion. The city was young, with no established philosophical tradition of its own. This institutional vacuum proved fertile ground for a thinker intent on breaking with the past, Rather than contending against an entrenched school, Parmenides could erect his system on entirely new foundations. A later tradition, preserved by Plutarch and Strabo, credits Parmenides with having drawn up the laws of Elea, laws the citizens swore annually to uphold. The report may be legendary, but it fits the profile of a mind preoccupied with order and logical necessity. The same architectural impulse that legislates for the polis also deduces the unbreakable laws of being. Regarding influences, the most plausible candidate is Xenophanes, whom ancient sources link to the founding of the Eleatic school. His critique of religious anthropomorphism and his concept of a single, unmoving, eternal God anticipate features of the Parmenidean entity, though in Xenophanes the argument remains theological, whereas Parmenides transforms it into ontology. Pythagoreanism, active throughout Magna Graecia, left its mark in the deductive rigor and mathematical language of the poem. Yet the relationship is polemical. Parmenides inverts Pythagorean dualism by denying plurality altogether. Finally, some scholars have noted that the argumentative structure of the poem, particularly its use of reductio ad absurdum, reflects procedures familiar from Greek forensic practice, which would cohere with the image of Parmenides as a public figure engaged in civic life. We have reached the philosophical core of the poem. The goddess reveals that there are exactly two paths of inquiry open to thought. The first declares, "It is, and it is not possible not to be." This is the path of persuasion, which attends upon truth. The second declares, "It is not, and it is necessary not to be." This path, she warns, is utterly impassable, for what is not can neither be known nor expressed in speech. The core thesis is compressed into a formula as famous as it is puzzling. Thinking and being are the same. This does not mean that thought creates reality. It means there is a strict correspondence between what can be thought and what is. Whatever can genuinely be thought exists. Whatever exists can be thought. Non-being, by contrast, cannot be thought at all. When we try to think nothingness, we literally think nothing. Thought requires an object, and that object is always something that is. From this flow three linked theses. The first is the identity of thinking and being. Thought is never an empty faculty, it is always directed toward what is. The second is the exclusivity of being. Non-being can be neither thought nor spoken, because to say, "it is not," is already to treat non-being as though it were something. The third is the necessity of being. What is can neither have failed to exist in the past nor cease to exist in the future. Contingency, the notion that something might not have been or might someday disappear, is logically eliminated. The goddess is uncompromising. There is no third way. Mortals, in their confusion, wander along an intermediate path where things sometimes are and sometimes are not, where being and non-being mingle. But that path does not exist. It is a mirage generated by naive trust in the senses. Logical rigor demands a choice. Either affirm being and deny non-being, or affirm non-being and forfeit thought itself. The goddess does not simply proclaim her thesis, she argues for it with a deductive rigor unprecedented in Greek literature. Three main arguments underpin the way of truth. The first argument establishes the radical unthinkability of non-being. To think is always to think something. To think nothing is not to think at all. Non-being has no predicates whatsoever, no properties, no location, no temporal coordinates. It cannot be an object of knowledge because there is nothing there to be known. And it cannot be stated without contradiction. Whoever says, something does not exist, is already treating that something as a subject, thereby granting it the very being the sentence purports to deny. The goddess is blunt. What is not, you can neither know nor speak. The second argument targets the possibility of generation and destruction directly. If something comes into being, it must arise either from being or from non-being, no third option exists. If it arises from being, it already was, so no genuine generation has occurred. If it arises from non-being, it springs from absolute nothingness, which is absurd. Nothing comes from nothing. The same logic governs destruction. What is cannot dissolve into nothing, because nothing is not a destination. The conclusion is inescapable. What is ungenerated and imperishable. It never began and it will never end. The entire spectacle of birth and death presented by the senses is, from the standpoint of reason, a logical impossibility. The third argument establishes the continuity and indivisibility of what is. Suppose what is had parts. What would separate one part from another? If something lay between them, that something would be either being or non-being. If it is being, then there is no real separation, the entity is continuous. If it is non-being, then the separation is nothing at all, and no division actually exists. Either way, division is impossible. What is forms a homogeneous continuum, without cracks, without ontological density gradients, without internal voids. Every region of what is equally full of being. The image of the sphere the goddess will later offer is not decorative metaphor, it is the geometric translation of this logical necessity. These three arguments form a deductive chain. If non-being is unthinkable, generation is impossible. If generation is impossible, what is eternal? If what is eternal, it can never have had parts that were once separate. The way of truth unfolds as a closed system, each thesis reinforcing the others. The goddess's arguments generate a set of consequences that transform our understanding of reality entirely. These are not speculative additions. They follow with logical necessity from the premises already established. The first consequence is the denial of becoming. All substantial change involves a transition from being to non-being or from non-being to being. The green leaf turns brown, the young man ages. What was ceases to be, and what was not comes into being. But this transition requires crossing a boundary between being and non-being, and no such boundary exists. Becoming is a logical impossibility. Nothing is born and nothing dies. What we perceive as change is a cognitive error induced by sensory trust. The second consequence concerns motion. For anything to move, there must be an empty space into which it can relocate. But what is absolutely full, compact, without internal voids? There is no place that is not already occupied by being. Motion requires positing non-being as the destination, and non-being is nothing. The entire kinetics of the universe, the wheeling stars, the flowing river, the bird taking flight, is reduced to sensory illusion. What remains motionless, not because some force restrains it, but because motion itself is conceptually incoherent. The third consequence is eternity, understood not as infinite duration but as timelessness. To say that what is, was, or will be, introduces temporal distinctions that presuppose change. But if what is immutable, there is no past and no future. There is only a continuous present that never began and will never cease. Time, like motion, is an appearance with no ontological foundation. The fourth consequence is the radical uniqueness of what is. If two distinct entities existed, something would have to account for their distinctness. But all difference is a form of non-being. One thing is not the other. Introducing difference means reintroducing the very non-being the goddess has declared unthinkable. Reality is therefore one and only one. The goddess compares it to a perfect sphere, like the bulk of a well-rounded sphere, equal from the center in every direction. This image is not cosmological but metaphysical. It expresses the completeness, symmetry, and self-identity of what is. Nothing is lacking, nothing is superfluous, nothing lies outside it. Reality is a closed, perfect, necessary whole. The way of truth is an argument of formidable elegance, but its interpretation is far from settled. 4 hermeneutical issues have occupied generations of scholars. The first problem concerns the very core of the system, the identity of thinking and being. Does Parmenides claim that thinking and being are strictly identical? If so, every act of thought would target something real. But what about false thoughts, illusions, errors? If I think of a centaur, and thinking is always thinking what is, then the centaur must somehow be. This would compromise the most basic realism. The weaker reading holds that Parmenides asserts only a necessary correspondence. One cannot think non-being, but one can think erroneously about what is. This preserves the possibility of error, but it dilutes the original argument's force considerably. The second problem is the tacit subject. The goddess proclaims, "It is, and it is not possible not to be." But what, exactly, is the subject of that verb? Parmenides never specifies. If the subject is what is, the argument applies only to what has already been defined as real. But if no subject is determined, the is has absolute, unrestricted scope. Everything that in any way is falls under its domain. The ambiguity may be deliberate. It allows the argument to operate with maximum generality, but it has unsettled interpreters since antiquity. The third problem concerns the very nature of non-being. Parmenides appears to treat every negation as existential negation. To say that something is not amounts, in his poem, to saying it does not exist at all. Yet ordinary language distinguishes between existential negation, the centaur does not exist, and predicative negation, Socrates is not musical. Plato, in the Sophist, would devote an entire dialogue to showing that predicative negation does not compromise the subject's existence. If Parmenides conflates these two senses, his argument may rest on an ambiguity. If he does not conflate them but deliberately identifies them, then he is advancing a far more radical thesis. There is no difference between existing and being of such and such a kind. The fourth problem is the famous sphere image. The goddess says what is like the bulk of a well-rounded sphere, equal from the center in every direction. Is this a metaphor for ontological perfection, completeness, and self-sufficiency? Or should it be taken literally, as a claim about the spatial shape of what is? If literal, what is would be finite and spherical, which raises an uncomfortable question: what lies outside the sphere? If something does, then what is not one. If nothing does, then non-being is reintroduced as a boundary. The tension between metaphorical and literal readings remains very much alive in contemporary scholarship. Contemporary Parmenides scholarship is shaped by three landmark interpretations. They are not entirely incompatible, but they differ markedly in what they take the poem to be about. Owen, in a highly influential paper from 1960, proposed what has become known as the logical reading. On this view, Parmenides was not doing ontology in any strong sense. He was investigating the conditions of meaningful discourse. The verb, to be, that dominates the poem should be read as a predicative copula, not as an existential verb. When the goddess says, "It is," she means that any subject of thought or speech must bear some predicate. Non-being would then be that of which nothing whatsoever can be predicated. The way of truth does not describe a mysterious reality. It lays down the logical rules that any coherent discourse must respect. Charles Kahn replied to Owen in 1969 with a robust defense of the ontological reading. For Kahn, imposing modern distinctions among the existential, copulative, and veridical uses of to be onto archaic Greek is an anachronism. In Parmenides' language, these three functions formed a single, unified notion. When the poem says, "It is," it means all three at once. What is exists, it is something in particular, and it is true. The break with earlier thought is genuinely metaphysical. Parmenides inaugurates ontology by asking, for the first time, about being qua being. Alexander Moraletos, in 1970, charted a third path, the modal reading. For Moraletos, the crucial distinction is not between being and non-being but between necessity and contingency. Parmenides' what is not simply what happens to exist. It is what has to be, what cannot not be. His great discovery was not being itself, but necessity, the modal category that separates what holds by accident from what holds by principle. The way of truth does not describe a static, spherical world. It sets out the conditions something must satisfy to count as necessary. We have reached the end of our examination of the way of truth. 3 points deserve to be taken away. First, Parmenides marks a definitive break with earlier cosmological thought. The question is no longer whether the principle of everything is water, air, or fire. The question is more radical. What conditions must reality satisfy if it is to be thought without contradiction? With this move, ontology is born as an autonomous philosophical discipline. Being is no longer an implicit presupposition of inquiry, it becomes the very subject matter of inquiry. Second, the way of truth unfolds a deductive argument of unprecedented rigor. The goddess asks for no faith, no mystical intuition, no revelation. She asks that we follow the reasoning to its final consequences. If non-being is unthinkable, and it is, then generation, motion, plurality, and time collapse one by one. Parmenides' poem is the first great deductive chain in the history of Western thought. Third, the challenge Parmenides issues to subsequent philosophy remains alive. The fracture he establishes between reason and the senses, between what thought demands and what experience delivers, runs like an open wound through the entire history of metaphysics. Plato devoted whole dialogues to answering him. Aristotle built his physics on the denial of his conclusions. And contemporary philosophy still debates whether non-being can be thought without self-contradiction. No one has been able to evade Parmenides' demands. Being is, non-being is not. All else is the opinion of mortals. For those wishing to pursue Parmenides further, the essential starting points begin with Diels and Kranz's Presocratic fragments, still the canonical edition of the Greek text. The commented translation by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield provides an excellent gateway to the context and interpretive problems. Patricia Curd's Presocratics Reader offers a more recent and highly accessible English translation. As for scholarship, 3 papers reshaped the contemporary debate. Owen's Eleatic Questions, which launched the logical reading, Charles Kahn's study of the Greek verb, to be, which defended the ontological reading, and Alexander Morelatos's The Root of Parmenides, which advanced the modal interpretation. John Palmer's Parmenides and Presocratic Philosophy, published in 2009, brings the discussion up to date and situates Parmenides within the broader landscape of early Greek thought. In the next lesson we shall turn to the second part of Parmenides' poem, The Way of Opinion. We will examine the cosmology the goddess unfolds after revealing the truth, the dualism of light and night, and the delicate problem of reconciling that exposition with the radical denial of change and plurality. We hope you join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.